Picture this. The air in your cell is a cold, wet blanket, thick with the smell of damp stone and your own unwashed body. You are a ghost, a state secret known only as the Nameless One, and you have been in this lightless world for 20 years. You can read, but the only book you have is a Bible your guards gave you. Its stories a strange counterpoint to your empty reality. You know you were once a ruler, you call yourself Gosudar, or sovereign, but the memory is a phantom limb, a feeling with no substance. Today, the silence is different. There are shouts. The fantasy you have nurtured in the dark, the one where someone remembers you, is coming true. But can you imagine the terror in that hope? And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. The story of Ivan VI, born Ivan Antonovich, is a tale of unparalleled cruelty, a Gothic horror story written in the gilded halls of the Russian court. His existence began not with a cry of joy, but as a pawn in a dying empress's desperate gambit for dynastic survival. The year was 1740. The Russian empress, Anna Ioannovna, niece of Peter the Great, was childless and her health was failing. The Russian throne, a brutal and precarious seat of power, was subject to the whims of its occupant, thanks to a decree by Peter the Great that allowed the reigning monarch to name their own successor. This had plunged the empire into a half-century of instability, a parade of palace coups and short-lived rulers. Empress Anna, determined to keep the throne within her own branch of the Romanov family, the lineage of Ivan V, looked to her only niece, a quiet, indolent woman named Anna Leopoldovna. To secure this lineage, a suitable husband had to be found for Anna Leopoldovna, and the choice fell upon Duke Anthony Ulrich of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a German prince who was brought to Russia in 1733 to be groomed for the role. Theirs was not a union of love, but of cold political calculation, a breeding program designed to produce an heir. Anna Leopoldovna, a woman more interested in daydreaming and affairs with her ladies-in-waiting, found her husband docile but uninspiring. The court itself was a viper's nest, dominated by Empress Anna's powerful and widely hated lover, the Duke of Courland, Ernst Johann von Biron. His contempt for the native Russian nobility and his heavy taxes had made him a figure of universal scorn. Into this poisonous atmosphere, on the 23rd of August, 1740, a son was born to Anna Leopoldovna and Anthony Ulrich. They named him Ivan. He was a healthy baby, utterly oblivious to the fact that his birth was not a family joy, but a state event, a lit fuse in the powder keg of the Russian court. Before he was even 2 months old, the dying Empress Anna Ioannovna formally adopted the infant and, from her deathbed, declared him her heir. The great game of succession had its new, tiny centerpiece. The baby Ivan was to be the emperor, but the real power, the regency, was handed not to his parents, but to the despised Biron. The stage was set for a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportions, one that would see this infant become a living ghost, his life a testament to the idea that for some, a crown is not a gift, but the most terrible of curses. His humanity would be systematically dismantled, his name erased, his existence reduced to a state secret whispered in the darkest corridors of power. The very foundations of his life were built on the paranoia and ambition of others, a weak foundation of political necessity that was destined to crumble into a lightless dungeon. On the 28th of October, 1740, with the death of Empress Anna, the 2-month-old infant became Ivan VI, Emperor and Autocrat of all the Russias. He was moved to the Winter Palace in a ceremony of grotesque splendor, a tiny, uncomprehending sovereign swallowed by the vast, cold machinery of the state. The true power, of course, resided with the regent, Ernst Johann von Biron, whose name was already synonymous with cruelty and corruption. His regency, however, lasted a mere 22 days. The Russian nobility, and even Ivan's own parents, Anna Leopoldovna and Anthony Ulrich, chafed under the rule of the arrogant Duke of Courland. With the backing of the influential Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph von Munich, a plot was hatched. In a swift, bloodless coup in the dead of night, Biron was arrested and his reign of terror brought to an unceremonious end. Power now fell to the infant emperor's mother, Anna Leopoldovna, who was declared regent. It was a disastrous choice. A woman described as an indolent daydreamer, she was woefully unprepared for the burdens of governance. Her days were spent in languid pleasure, reading novels in bed, often not rising until the afternoon, and showing little interest in the tedious affairs of state. Her court became a reflection of her own character, disorganized, pleasure-seeking, and dominated by her German favorites and her passionate affairs, most notably with the Saxon ambassador, Count Moritz Zulinar, and her lady-in-waiting, Julie von Mengden. Her husband, Anthony Ulrich, was marginalized, forced to sleep in another palace, while his wife carried on her affairs, a cuckolded prince whose complaints were casually dismissed. While the regent was distracted, the administration of the vast empire drifted. This vacuum of leadership and the overt preference for German advisors created a deep well of resentment among the powerful Russian Guards regiments, the traditional arbiters of power in St. Petersburg. Their gaze began to fall upon another figure, a woman who possessed the blood of Peter the Great himself, the 32-year-old Princess Elizabeth Petrovna. Elizabeth was everything Anna Leopoldovna was not: vivacious, ambitious, and profoundly Russian in her sensibilities. As the daughter of the nation's most revered modernizing Tsar, she represented a return to a more glorious, nationalistic past. For years, she had been kept on the political sidelines, watched constantly by secret agents, her very existence a threat to the reigning branch of the family. Now, sensing the weakness of the regent and urged on by the French ambassador, who hoped to undermine Austrian influence at court, Elizabeth saw her moment. The conspiracy took shape in the cold autumn of 1741, a whispering campaign that quickly solidified into a concrete plan for a coup. The stage was set for another violent shift in power, another midnight seizure of the throne. The baby emperor, Ivan VI, slept in his cradle, his one-year reign, overseen by a feckless mother, about to come to a brutal and decisive end. His name, once proclaimed from every pulpit, was about to become a forbidden word, the first step in his deliberate erasure from the pages of history. The night of the 6th of December, 1741, was bitterly cold. Snow blanketed the streets of St. Petersburg as a sledge carrying and determined Princess Elizabeth cut through the silent city. Holding a silver cross, she rode not to a royal ball, but to the barracks of the elite Preobrazhensky Guard, the very heart of Russia's military power. There, appealing to their patriotism and their resentment of the German-dominated court, she made her plea. "Who do you want to serve? Me, the natural sovereign, or those who have stolen my inheritance?" The response was overwhelming. The guards, loyal to the memory of her father, Peter the Great, rallied to her cause. They marched on the Winter Palace, their objective not just to seize power, but to physically seize the infant emperor and his entire family. The palace was taken without a fight. Elizabeth, a commanding and charismatic figure, swept into the imperial apartments. There, she found the regent, Anna Leopoldovna, and her husband, Anthony Ulrich, in their beds. They were arrested along with their handful of loyal advisors. The final, most pathetic act of the drama took place in the imperial nursery. The soldiers found the one-year-old Emperor of Russia, Ivan VI, sleeping peacefully in his cradle. He was scooped up and carried out, his brief, ceremonial reign ending in the bewildered terror of a child roused from sleep by armed strangers. By morning, Elizabeth had been proclaimed Empress of all the Russias by the assembled clergy and nobility. One of her first acts was to begin the systematic and total erasure of Ivan VI. An imperial manifesto was issued, demanding that the populace swear allegiance to the new empress. All coins bearing the image of the infant Tsar were ordered to be withdrawn from circulation and melted down. Public documents, oaths of loyalty, and any paper bearing his name were to be found and publicly burned. It was a political damnatio memoria, a condemnation of memory. The child was to be unpersoned, to become a non-entity. The initial plan, or at least the one publicly stated, was to expel the entire Brunswick-Romanov family from Russia. They were first transported to the fortress of Dunamunda, near Riga, in what was presented as the first step toward exile in Europe. But Elizabeth, settling onto her new throne, had second thoughts. Can a rival claimant, even a toddler, ever be truly neutralized if they are allowed to live freely abroad, a potential rallying point for future plots? The paranoia that is the constant companion of usurped power began to take hold. The plan for exile was quietly abandoned. The journey eastward turned back on itself, and the family was plunged deeper into the heart of the empire they had once ruled. In June of 1744, after a court conspiracy known as the Lopukina affair spooked the empress, the decision was made to tighten the security around the family. They were moved to Rannenburg, and then further north, to the remote town of Kolmogorov, a place of desolate cold on the White Sea. It was here that the true, soul-crushing nature of their imprisonment began, and here that the most monstrous decision was made. The threat was not the feckless Anna Leopoldovna or her passive husband. The threat was the boy, and so Ivan was separated from his family forever. He was to be raised in absolute isolation, a ghost in a provincial prison, while his parents and the siblings born to them in captivity lived under guard in a separate house, never to see their firstborn son again. At Kolmogorov, in the cold, remote north, the process of dehumanization began in earnest. The boy once known as Emperor Ivan VI was now simply a certain prisoner. He was confined to a small, specially constructed set of rooms within the archbishop's house, completely isolated from the outside world, and most importantly, from his own family who were imprisoned nearby. He could hear the ringing of the cathedral bells, perhaps even the distant sounds of his own siblings, but he could never see them. Anna Leopoldovna, his mother, would die in this desolate exile in 1746, succumbing to puerperal fever after the birth of her last child, Alexei. She was buried with state honors in St. Petersburg, a final, cynical piece of theater by the regime that had destroyed her. Her husband, Anthony Ulrich, was given the choice to leave Russia, but only if he abandoned his children. He refused, and remained a prisoner in Kolmogorov until his death nearly 3 decades later, a testament to a father's love in the most hopeless of circumstances. But their fate, grim as it was a paradise compared to their sons. Ivan was raised by his jailer, seeing no other human face for 12 years. The instructions from Empress Elizabeth were brutally specific. He was not to be educated. He was to be kept ignorant of his origins, of his name, of the world itself. The goal was to create a human vegetable, a being with no sense of self, no ambition, no intelligence that could ever be used to challenge the throne. The sensory deprivation was profound. He lived in a world of gray walls, of silence broken only by the guard's footsteps. Yet, the human mind is a stubborn thing. Despite the explicit orders against it, someone, perhaps a sympathetic guard or the jailer himself, took pity on the boy. He was taught his letters, he learned to read, and was given a Bible. This single act of kindness, this small crack of light in his dark world, would prove to be both a comfort and a curse. It gave him an inner world, but it also gave him the tools to comprehend the sheer horror of his situation. And somehow, despite all the efforts to erase his identity, the truth leaked through. Whether through a careless word from a guard, or through the boy's own piecing together of the fragments of his existence, he came to understand who he was. He knew he was of imperial origin. In the empty solitude of his cell, the boy who was meant to be a nobody began calling himself Gozud or Sovereign. This knowledge was dangerous. As rumors of a mysterious, high-born prisoner in Kolmogorov began to circulate, the state's paranoia intensified. In 1756, the decision was made to move him again. He was secretly transferred to the infamous Schlisselberg fortress, an island prison in the middle of the Neva River, a place from which no one ever returned. Here, the isolation would be even more absolute. He was placed in a casemate, a vaulted chamber within the fortress walls, under the watch of 2 permanent officers, Captain Vlasiev and Lieutenant Chekin. So intense was the secrecy that not even the commandant of the fortress was told the true identity of the prisoner in their midst. He was now Nameless Prisoner Number One. His world shrank to a single room, his human contact to 2 guards who were themselves prisoners of his secret. He was 20 years old, and his life of torment was about to enter its final, most dreadful chapter. Schlisselberg Fortress was the Russian Empire's answer to the Bastille, a cold stone oubliette rising from the waters of Lake Ladoga at the mouth of the Neva River. It was a place designed to swallow people whole, to erase them from memory and from the world. For Nameless Prisoner Number One, it was the final destination. His new cell was even more bleak than his quarters at Kolmogorov. It was a casemate, number 9, a vaulted brick chamber deep within the fortress walls, designed to withstand cannon fire but now repurposed to contain a single, broken man. Light and air were meager commodities, filtering through a single, heavily barred window that offered no view of the outside world. The security surrounding him was an obsession, a manifestation of the state's deep-seated fear of this ghost it had created. His 2 guards, Captain Vlasiev and Lieutenant Chekin, were not mere turnkeys. They were his permanent companions and potential executioners. They were forbidden from speaking to him about anything of substance, their conversations limited to the barest necessities. Yet, a strange, suffocating domesticity took hold. They dined with him in the evenings, a grotesque parody of a family meal where the most important topic, his own identity, was a terrifying taboo. The psychosocial deprivation, the lack of sunlight, meaningful conversation, or any normal human interaction, began to take its predictable and terrible toll. Years of this crushing solitude and sensory deprivation had undeniably disturbed his mental equilibrium. Reports from his guards describe a young man prone to fits of rage and despair, a figure who would pace his cell endlessly, muttering to himself. His speech became halting, a painful stammer that made communication difficult and frustrating. He was, by all accounts, descending into a state of severe psychological distress, exhibiting symptoms we would now associate with intense trauma, paranoia, anxiety, and aggression born of utter helplessness. Yet he was not, as some accounts later claimed, a complete idiot or human vegetable. The core of his identity, the knowledge that he was the rightful sovereign, remained fiercely intact. He clung to this fact with a furious, desperate energy. He would insist on being called Gosudar, and when his guards, following their orders, refused, he would fly into rages. These outbursts were met with brutal punishment. The new instructions, first from Empress Elizabeth and later confirmed and even strengthened by her successors, were sadistic. If he became agitated or violent, he was to be chained to the wall and beaten. Imagine the psychological torture. The only assertion of self-worth you have, the one truth you cling to in a world of lies and emptiness, is the very thing that brings you physical agony. This was his reality for years, a closed loop of suffering where resistance led to pain, and submission led to the annihilation of his soul. In 1762, there was a brief, bizarre interruption in this routine. The new emperor, Peter III, a man of erratic and unstable temperament, paid a secret visit to Schlisselberg. He interviewed the nameless prisoner, perhaps out of morbid curiosity, perhaps, as some historians speculate, because he was considering naming Ivan his heir to spite his own wife, Catherine. Whatever the motive, the visit only resulted in a fresh wave of cruelty. It was Peter who reinforced the orders that Ivan should be beaten for any misbehavior. But Peter's reign was a flash in the pan. Within months, he himself was overthrown and murdered in a coup orchestrated by his brilliant and ambitious German wife, who now ascended the throne as Empress Catherine II, soon to be known as Catherine the Great. The nameless prisoner in Schlisselberg would now have a new and final mistress of his fate. The ascension of Catherine the Great in 1762 marked the final turning point in the tragic life of Ivan VI. For Catherine, a usurper with no direct blood claim to the Russian throne, the existence of a previous, legitimately crowned Emperor Revan I who had been imprisoned since infancy was an intolerable and constant threat. Ivan was a living symbol of a rival claim, a potential figurehead for any noble faction or military regiment that might seek to depose her. Shortly after taking power, Catherine, like Peter III before her, made the secret journey to Schlisselberg to see the nameless convict for herself. Her assessment, recorded for posterity, was a masterpiece of political justification, painting Ivan as a subhuman creature whose restoration was unthinkable. She wrote that, apart from his painful and almost unintelligible stammering, he was bereft of understanding and human intelligence. This was the official narrative. Ivan was a damaged, incoherent wreck, unfit to rule. But Catherine's actions betrayed a deeper fear. She knew that his legitimacy did not depend on his mental state, but on the simple fact of his birth and prior coronation. He was a ghost who could still topple an empire. So, Catherine reissued and reinforced the most terrible order of all. A secret instruction was given to Ivan's guards, Vlasiev and Chekin. It was a standing death warrant. Under no circumstances was the prisoner to be delivered into anyone's hands. If any attempt was made to free him, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, the guards were to kill him immediately and without question. The state that had stolen his life now formally authorized his murder. His own rescue would be the trigger for his execution. This horrifying order, a secret passed down from Elizabeth, now bore the full authority of Catherine the Great. She had effectively signed his death warrant and left it in the hands of his jailers to be enacted at their discretion. The fortress of Schlisselberg was transformed from a prison into a death trap, where the only possible escape for its most famous prisoner was death itself. Meanwhile, a new officer had been assigned to the garrison at Schlisselberg. His name was Vasily Mirovich, a young sub-lieutenant of Ukrainian origin with a tormented past and grandiose ambitions. His family's estates had been confiscated decades earlier by Peter the Great, and Mirovich grew up in poverty, nursing a deep-seated grievance against the state and dreaming of a way to restore his family's fortunes. Stationed at the fortress, the young officer's curiosity was piqued by the intense secrecy surrounding Nameless Prisoner Number One. Through observation and questioning, he eventually pieced together the explosive truth. The stammering, abused man in Casemate 9 was Ivan VI, the rightful emperor of Russia. In this discovery, Mirovich saw his destiny. He would be the one to free the true Tsar, depose the German usurper Catherine, and in the process, gain fame, fortune, and the restoration of his family's honor. It was a wildly ambitious and fatally naive plan, born of personal desperation and a profound ignorance of the secret order that governed Ivan's life. He began to search for accomplices, convinced he was embarking on a righteous crusade. The stage was set for the final act, a collision between one man's desperate ambition and another man's state-sanctioned death sentence. Vasily Mirovich's conspiracy was a frantic, almost amateurish affair, driven more by romantic idealism and personal desperation than by tactical genius. He saw himself as a kingmaker, a righteous liberator destined for glory. His first and only significant accomplice was another officer named Apollon Ushakov, with whom he drafted a manifesto declaring Ivan VI the legitimate emperor and Catherine a usurper. Their initial plan was convoluted, involving a forged decree from the empress to secure Ivan's release. But before they could act, Ushakov was conveniently transferred to another post, and whether through real or feigned illness, removed himself from the plot, leaving Mirovich dangerously isolated. Undeterred, Mirovich decided to proceed alone. He believed that if he could just present the living Ivan to the soldiers of the St. Petersburg garrison, they would flock to his banner just as they had for Elizabeth 2 decades earlier. He fatally misunderstood the political climate. Catherine, unlike Anna Leopoldovna, was a shrewd and powerful ruler who commanded respect and fear. On the night of the 16th of July, 1764, just after 2 in the morning, Mirovich made his move. Having worked himself into a messianic fervor, he roused a small number of his own men, feeding them a story of a secret order to liberate the prisoner. He managed to seize the main fortress gate, and, in the ensuing confusion, clubbed the fortress commandant, Borodnikov, into unconsciousness. He then directed a cannon at the casemate where Ivan was being held, demanding his release. A firefight broke out between Mirovich's handful of supporters and the small contingent of guards defending the inner prison. Inside the cell, the noise of gunfire and shouting must have been both terrifying and electrifying for Ivan. After 23 years of silence and abuse, it was the sound of deliverance he had perhaps fantasized about in the endless dark. But for his guards, Captain Vlasiev and Lieutenant Chekin, the noise was the signal they had dreaded for years. It was the trigger for their secret, standing order. As Mirovich and his men breached the final defenses and rushed towards the casemate, they were met not with resistance, but with a horrifying sight. Vlasiev and Chekin, having just agreed to a ceasefire, opened the cell door. There, on the floor, lay the body of Ivan VI. Following their explicit instructions from Catherine the Great, the 2 guards had murdered their prisoner to prevent his rescue. The boy who had been crowned emperor in his cradle lay dead in a pool of his own blood, slain by the very men who had been his only companions for years. Mirovich stood over the corpse, his grand ambitions turned to ash. His righteous crusade had ended in the murder of the man he sought to save. With Ivan dead, the entire purpose of the coup evaporated. The man who was to be the new emperor was gone. Mirovich, utterly broken, immediately surrendered. His rebellion had lasted less than an hour. The aftermath of the Schlisselberg tragedy was swift and brutal, a masterclass in Catherine the Great's political shrewdness and ruthlessness. With Ivan VI dead, the most potent living threat to her throne was eliminated. The corpse of the murdered ex-emperor was briefly put on display in the fortress, a grim testament to the fate of those who challenged the autocracy before being buried in a secret, unmarked grave somewhere within the fortress grounds, his final resting place as anonymous as his life had been. His killers, the guards Vlashev and Chekin, were not punished but rewarded. They received promotions and cash bonuses for their perfect adherence to Catherine's secret command, a chilling affirmation that they had done exactly what the state required of them. For Vasily Mirovich, there would be no such reward. His fate was sealed. He was taken to St. Petersburg and subjected to a public trial. Catherine's government, attempting to distance the empress from the murder she had personally authorized, tried to paint Mirovich as a lone, deranged fanatic. Mirovich himself remained oddly calm throughout the proceedings, perhaps believing to the very end that he might receive a last-minute pardon for his noble, if failed, intentions. He was wrong. On the 26th of September, 1764, he was publicly decapitated. His execution was a terrifying spectacle for the public, as the death penalty had not been carried out in Russia for over 2 decades. His remains were burned along with the scaffold, another, a deliberate act of erasure. The other soldiers involved in the plot were forced to run the gauntlet, a brutal punishment of being beaten by their fellow soldiers, and were then exiled to Siberia. The message was clear and unambiguous. Loyalty to Catherine would be rewarded. Any hint of rebellion would be met with absolute obliteration. The ghost of Ivan VI had been exorcised. But what of his family, the other Brunswick Romanovs who had languished in exile at Kolmogorov for decades? They remained prisoners. Their brother's murder did not secure their freedom. It was not until 1780, 16 years after Ivan's death, that Catherine finally allowed the 4 surviving siblings, Catherine, Elizabeth, Peter, and Alexeido, be released. Ranging in age from 34 to 39, they had known no other life but imprisonment. They were sent into the custody of their aunt, the Dowager Queen of Denmark, Juliana Maria, and settled in the Danish town of Horsens. There, they lived under a comfortable form of house arrest for the rest of their lives, financially supported by Catherine the Great, the woman who had ordered their brother's death. They had a small court of Danish servants but were socially isolated, strange relics of a forgotten tragedy. They never married and left no children, the final fading embers of a branch of the Romanov dynasty that had been systematically and utterly destroyed. The story of Ivan VI is more than just a tragic footnote in the grand sweep of Russian history. It is a profound and disturbing meditation on the nature of power itself. His life serves as a grotesque testament to the principle that in the world of absolute monarchy, an individual's humanity is entirely subordinate to the symbolic value they possess. Ivan was never a person, he was a claim. He was born a pawn, lived as a ghost, and died a sacrifice. His existence was a political inconvenience, and so it was systematically erased, first from the public record and then from the world of the living. The cruelty inflicted upon him was not born of simple, personal sadism, but of a cold, rational, and terrifying political logic. To Empress Elizabeth, and later to Catherine the Great, the boy in the cell represented a perpetual seed of instability. He was the true Tsar in a system where legitimacy was a matter of blood, and their own claims were, by comparison, flawed. Their paranoia was not unfounded. The 18th century in Russia was defined by the palace coup, where the loyalty of a few guard regiments could change the course of the empire in a single night. In such a system, a living, legitimate alternative claimant could not be tolerated. The state, in its relentless drive for self-preservation, developed a kind of political psychosis, and Ivan was the object of its obsession. The order for his death upon any rescue attempt is the ultimate expression of this logic. His symbolic value was so great that his physical existence had to be terminated the moment he threatened to become politically real. His life was a non-life, a state of suspended animation between the throne he briefly occupied and the grave that was his destiny. He was a human sacrifice laid upon the altar of dynastic stability, his suffering the hidden price for the glittering reigns of Elizabeth and Catherine. The complicity of the system is just as chilling. The guards, the courtiers, the commandant's figures like Vlasiev and Chekin were not necessarily monsters. They were cogs in a machine, enforcers of a system that demanded their moral compromise. They acted out of fear, ambition, and a desensitized acceptance of the state's absolute authority. They kept the secret, enforced the isolation, and when the time came, committed the murder, all in the service of an abstract concept of order. Ivan's story forces a confrontation with the human cost of political absolutism. It demonstrates how a system built on the divine right of kings and the untrammeled will of the autocrat can justify the complete annihilation of a single human life for the sake of its own continuity. He was born to be imprisoned, his identity a crime, his very breath a threat to the crown. He is history's ultimate victim of circumstance, a boy whose tragedy was to be born too close to a throne in a land where power was a blood sport, and the losers were not merely defeated, but utterly, terrifyingly unmade.